A historic vote at the United Nations on slavery.
Therefore, draft resolution A/80/L48 is adopted.
The UN General Assembly's declared that slavery is the gravest crime against humanity, specifically the enslavement of some 12 million Africans and their descendants through the transatlantic slave trade. The resolution put forward by Ghana was harshly criticized by the United States, where tens of millions of descendants of enslaved Africans live today. We'll be talking about that later on. First, I want to hear the reaction from Ghana. DW correspondent Isaac Kaleji is in the Ghanaian capital, Accra. Isaac, good to see you.
Thank you, David.
So before we talk more about this historic vote at the UN, let's just look at what the resolution says. The resolution calls the transatlantic slave trade the gravest crime against humanity. It calls for UN member states to engage in dialogue on a full and formal apology and for reparations as a concrete step toward remedying historical wrongs. The resolution also urges the prompt and unhindered restitution of cultural items to their countries of origin. 123 countries voted in favor of the resolution. 3 voted against it, including the United States, and 52 countries abstained, including the UK and all of the European Union. So, Isaac, let's start, though, with Ghana. How are people there reacting to the news?
So a lot of people have been following this particular campaign for a long time, like 3 years ago, but this year, it has been intense and people have been following, and a lot of celebrations in terms of people being happy about the fact that eventually their president was able to lead this campaign and the UN has adopted this resolution. So the reaction has been positive. People have been happy about the development today.
And Isaac, Ghana has been pushing for this resolution for a while now. Tell us more about what's behind that.
So Ghana has been the epicenter, really, of this whole narrative about slavery because the country has several castles and forts, and many of them were used in the this slavery trade that took place many centuries ago. And across the country, in fact, we have 2 of the key castles, the Elmina Castle and also the Kepo Castles, where people always come to visit to see the devastation that took place because of slavery. And seeing this edifice there and trying to remember exactly how our forefathers actually had to struggle and be taken along the oceans to other parts of the world as slaves, it's something that really keeps people thinking. And I think that this drive or campaign for reparative justice actually is anchored on that we see the remnants of this and we think that something ought to be done, especially even with the issue of securing formal apology from countries that really carried out this particular activity, and in a way having some reparative justice for victims. So this has been ongoing for 3 years now, and eventually we've gotten to this point, driven of course by the passion of the current president who wanted to get this resolution adopted.
And Isaac, let's listen to what UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said about it.
Today we reflect on a deep betrayal of human dignity, the abduction of millions of Africans, stolen from families and communities they would never see again. I've often said the transatlantic slave trade was a crime against humanity that struck at the core of personhood, broke up families, and devastated communities. I welcome the steps some countries are taking to apologize for their role in the evil of slavery and to join an honest dialogue about its lasting consequences.
Now, Isaac, the resolution calls for reparations for slavery. Are there any specifics on who should be paying reparations to whom?
Okay, so in the resolution that was actually sent to the UN by the Ghanaian or the African team, I should say, the reparation, the demand is that it should be paid by countries that undertook this practice and countries that also benefited from it. So like you mentioned in your introduction, the US, of course, benefited. So they obviously should also partake in paying. And some European countries really who took part in this slavery trade, they ought to pay the reparation. Now, the question has been to whom, and of course, that has been one of the key issues why some countries like the US, or even, for example, the UK, decided not to vote in favor. They, according to the team, they're not asking for money to be paid to African countries or governments. No, they're asking that they should be channeled into a fund that obviously helps to correct some of the imbalances that we've had in the current world because of the slavery, and also to be able to ensure that people who really have been victims of this slavery can be able to heal again and be able to rebuild, get the tools, the skills they need to be economically empowered, so that we can bridge this disparity when it comes to economic fortunes across the world. So that is really the model that they are trying to propose. They are not asking that the money is to be given to governments, but they want it to go towards targeted campaigns that helps to correct some of the anomalies that has taken place because of the slavery.
And it sounds like that there would have to be a lot of discussions about exactly what those reparations would look like. Isaac, thanks so much for talking to us.
Thank you.
Let's go to the U.S. now. Gerald Horne is a professor of history at the University of Houston. He's published dozens of books, many of them about slavery, including The Capital of Slavery, Washington, D.C., 1800 to 1865. Gerald, so good to have you with us. What's your reaction to this resolution being passed?
Well, I think it's a significant step forward. Certainly, it'll be quite useful in the United States of America because, as you probably know, there is an ongoing struggle for reparations to the descendants of enslaved Africans. You may also know that the administration in Washington, D.C., speaking of that, led by Mr. Trump, is unequivocally hostile to this question of reparations. And I would also like to give a note of celebration and victory, indeed, to the president of Ghana, Mr. Mahama, who is walking in the footsteps of the founding father of this West African nation, speaking of the late, great Kwame Nkrumah. And all around, I think it's a significant step forward.
Yeah, we're definitely going to be talking about reparations in just a second. What does this resolution mean on an emotional and symbolic level for the African diaspora, specifically for people whose ancestors were enslaved?
Well, I think it's quite profound. We in the United States oftentimes recognize that since the population of African descent is a distinct minority, perhaps 13 to 16% of the overall population, we've also and often needed international support and international validation in order to make a step forward. And I think that this resolution at the United Nations is precisely the kind of validation that we have needed in order to propel this movement for reparations, in fact.
So you're saying that basically African Americans, in a sense, needed Ghana to put this resolution forward?
Oh, absolutely. As you may know, the United States is known quite properly as a conservative country. You may also know that polls suggest that a significant percentage of the non-descendants of enslaved Africans are hostile to reparations. They are represented in Washington by Mr. Trump. And so in order to move the needle, we've needed this kind of international validation, which we've just received at the United Nations.
Now, over 50 countries did abstain in this vote, including the UK and the entire European Union. 3 countries, including the US, voted against the resolution. And one reason the U.S. named is that calling slavery the gravest crime against humanity, it said, would create a hierarchy of crimes against humanity, essentially saying that enslavement is worse than other crimes against humanity, including murder and rape and torture. The U.S. ambassador to the UN said, this is not a competition. What's your response to that?
Well, as you probably know, the African slave trade involved murder, rape, and torture. You may also know that the African slave trade lasted for hundreds of years, from the 1500s up until the late 19th century. You may also know that there are still reverberations and repercussions of the unlimited African slave trade in terms of the United States of America, in particular in terms of spiraling rates of incarceration, high rates of unemployment, spectacular rates of infant mortality and death for children. So I think that the resolution, in many ways, is right on point.
Gerald, I do want to play a few clips from the UN General Assembly debate on this resolution and get your response. The first one is Ghana's President John Dramani Mahama clearly taking aim at the US and at Donald Trump.
Black history courses are being removed from school curricula. Schools are being mandated to stop teaching students about the truth of slavery, segregation, and racism in American history courses. Books about those topics are being banned in schools and public libraries. Museums, art centers, and other institutions whose budgets rely in any way on public funds are being prohibited from scheduling exhibitions and programs or from displaying materials promoting racial awareness or Black history. At the very least, they are slowly normalizing the erasure. They're slowly normalizing erasure.
That was Ghanaian President John Dramani Mahama. Now let's hear what the U.S. ambassador to the UN had to say.
The United States strongly objects to the cynical usage of historical wrongs as a leverage point in an attempt to reallocate modern resources to people and nations who are distantly related to the historical victims.
U.S. Ambassador Dan Negria speaking there. Gerald, what's your response to this idea that it's too late for reparations called for slavery?
Well, I disagree ferociously. In fact, as you may know, there is a principle of U.S. law which suggests that when there is a wrong, there should be a remedy. The wrong was the enslavement of millions. The remedy is reparations. And in any case, I was rather mystified by the fact that the U.S. ambassador spoke of countries receiving reparations when in his own backyard in New York City, there are millions of descendants of enslaved Africans who are living in desperate poverty as we speak, as direct relationship to the crime against humanity that was the African slave trade.
Now, you are also a lawyer, so I want to ask you about another criticism brought up by the U.S., and I'm quoting Ambassador Negria here. While we acknowledge the horrors of the past, the United States also does not recognize a legal right to reparations for historical wrongs that were not illegal under international law at the time when they occurred. Gerald, what do you think about that?
Well, I think that that's a questionable invocation of law. And I might also go a step forward to suggest that next in line for reparations, at least in North America, are the descendants of the indigenous population, the Native American population, who were subjected to genocide, which was the condition precedent to dragging Africans and chained across the ocean to work for free. And certainly it's rather disappointing, I must say, that many members of the European Union voted against this voted against this resolution concerning the African slave trade. Now, I know that they want to stay on the good side of Mr. Trump, but even having said that, I think that the ultimate and the utmost of cynicism is the vote of nations like Britain and Portugal and Spain, whose current standard of living and current modernity is attached and connected directly to the unlamented African slave trade.
Gerald, you've mentioned reparations several times now. What else do you think needs to happen at this point to address the wrongs of slavery and their ongoing impact on people today?
Well, I think that Mr. Mahama, the president of Ghana, laid out many other issues. For example, as he suggested in his riveting remarks, there's an ongoing campaign to not teach what happened during the time of slavery. And I speak to you as a person who teaches this issue. That is to say that it is said to be indoctrination if you talk about the horrors of slavery. Obviously, what's at play is the United States would like to portray itself as a shining city on the hill. And it's difficult to make that kind of distorted picture if teachers are teaching about the horrors of the African slave trade. And so certainly education, a dedicated campaign to educate people, not only in the United States, but I would insist globally, about the horrors of what befell Africa in particular.
Gerald, moving forward, how do you see this resolution impacting the conversation about slavery and its effects?
Well, I think it'll have significant impact. As you probably know, there is a chain of Black radio stations in the United States of America. I am certain and confident that this will be a subject of discussion on these radio stations. There are also numerous Black newspapers. Those newspapers will be printing columns, I assure you, about this resolution. And inevitably, what happens is that these kinds of issues spread from the Black press into the wider U.S. mainstream, and thereby it becomes a powerful tool for education.
Professor Gerald Horne, thank you so much for your time. What do you think? Is it time for nations to apologize for slavery and pay reparations? Let us know in the comments. And if you like this video, please hit the like button. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already.